The hook, don't touch her again. Ever. Don't you touch her again. The housekeeper is standing over the fiancé, dark uniform, white-knuckled. Her right hand is still vibrating from the impact of the correction she just delivered. She's breathing in sharp, jagged bursts. She is terrified, not of the woman cowering on the marble, but of the boundary she just obliterated, the invisible line between servant and master that can never be uncrossed. The woman on the floor is stunning, the kind of expensive beauty that is bought and maintained. Her palm is pressed to her cheek, but her eyes aren't wide with pain. They are wide with pure, cold outrage, because the American help, just put a hand on her. Behind Danielle, a wheelchair. In it, a 71-year-old Korean woman. Her reading glasses lie on the floor, one lens spider-webbed against the stone. Her left cheek is stained with a fresh, blooming handprint. The elevator chimes. The heavy doors slide open. A man walks in, suit sharp, presence like a shadow. He sees his fiancée on the floor, his housekeeper standing like a shield, and his mother in a wheelchair with a broken lens at her feet. 3 people, 3 versions of the truth. 10 seconds to decide which one to believe. 4 months ago, Danielle Washington arrived at this penthouse with 1 suitcase, a work visa, and a promise made to her grandmother. Today, she stopped being careful, and nothing in this house will ever be the same again. The service entrance of the Jang penthouse was located at the end of a corridor, so polished it felt like walking on frozen water. Danielle Washington stood there, her fingers white-knuckle tight around the handle of a single, battered suitcase that had seen too many Greyhound buses before it ever saw an international flight. She was 30 years old, an American from a town where the dirt was red and the heat was heavy, and here she was in the heart of Gangnam, where the air smelled of expensive ozone and filtered lilies. She adjusted the collar of her navy blouse, the only piece of clothing she owned that didn't have a stray thread or a faded seam. She had ironed it that morning on the floor of her tiny hostel room, pressing the fabric with a heated pot because she couldn't find an ironing board. It was a makeshift solution, but Danielle was a woman built on makeshift solutions. As she waited for the heavy steel door to click open, she felt the weight of her grandmother's voice in the back of her mind. "You have strong hands, Danny," the old woman had told her, her own hands gnarled like cedar roots. "Don't you ever let anyone tell you they're just for scrubbing floors. You use them to hold people up. You use them to keep the world from tipping over for those who can't stand on their own." The door hummed, a motorized lock sliding back with a sound that felt like a finality. The interior of the penthouse didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum dedicated to the concept of silence. The ceilings were impossibly high, the walls a series of muted grays and cold marbles. There were no family photos on the side tables, no stray shoes by the door, no smell of burnt toast or lingering perfume. It was a vacuum. A man was waiting for her in the foyer. Jang Tae-hyun didn't look like a son. He looked like a CEO who had mistakenly wandered into a domestic space. His suit was a dark, weaponized gray, and his eyes remained fixed on the glowing screen of his phone even as he spoke. "You're late by 3 minutes," he said, his English perfect, clinical, and devoid of any welcoming lilt. "The bus schedule was—" "I don't pay for explanations, Miss Washington. I pay for results," he interrupted, finally looking up. His gaze was an assessment, a quick calculation of her utility. "My mother is in the East Wing. She is a former professor of linguistics. Now she is a liability of health. You will feed her, you will move her every 2 hours to prevent sores, and you will ensure she does not embarrass the family when guests are present. Do you understand?" Danielle felt a flash of heat in her chest, not at the rudeness, but at the word liability. She looked at her hands, the ones meant to hold people up, and then back at the man who saw his own mother as a broken piece of furniture. "I understand my duties, Mr. Jang," Danielle replied, her voice steady, carrying the quiet thunder of the South. He gestured vaguely toward the long, shadowed hallway. "The agency said you were the best. Prove it. If she loses more weight or if I hear her crying, you'll be on a plane back to Georgia before your first paycheck clears." He walked past her without waiting for a response, the scent of his expensive, sterile cologne trailing behind him like an afterthought. Danielle stood alone in the foyer for a moment, the silence of the penthouse pressing in on her ears. She picked up her suitcase, the wheels clicking loudly against the marble as she began the long walk toward the east wing. She didn't know then that this house was a fortress built of secrets. She didn't know about the woman waiting in the shadows of the master bedroom, or the choreographed cruelty that was already being planned. All she knew was that somewhere at the end of this cold, gray hallway was a woman who had been silenced, and Danielle's hands were already beginning to itch for the work of holding her up. The east wing of the penthouse was where the silence grew teeth. As Danielle pushed open the heavy oak doors, the air changed, losing the sterile, expensive scent of Taehyun's cologne and replacing it with the faint, clinical smell of antiseptic and unmoving air. In the center of a room that was far too large for one person sat Oh Kyung-ya. She was positioned by a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the sprawling gray veins of Seoul, but her chair hadn't been angled to see the view. Instead, she was turned toward a shadow-filled corner of the room. At 71, the woman looked like a delicate ink drawing that had been left out in the rain, blurred, faded, and dangerously close to dissolving. Her hands, once capable of gesturing toward chalkboards and flipping through thick academic journals, lay in her lap like broken birds. "Mrs. O," Danielle said softly, her voice echoing against the minimalist walls. "My name is Danielle. I'm here to help you." There was no response. Not a flicker of a gaze, not a twitch of a finger. Kyung-ya remained perfectly still, her spine curved forward as if the weight of the silence in the house had finally snapped her posture. Danielle walked around the chair to face her, and what she saw made her breath hitch. Kyung-ya wasn't just resting, she was retreated. Her eyes were open, but they were fixed on a spot on the floor with a terrifying, hollow intensity. It wasn't the vacant stare of someone who had lost their mind. It was the guarded, vibrating stillness of someone who was hiding inside their own skin. A stack of books sat on a nearby mahogany table, their spines unbroken, coated in a fine layer of dust. Danielle recognized the titles, heavy texts on linguistics and classical literature. These were the remains of the professor, the woman who had once commanded lecture halls and shaped the minds of a generation. Now, those books served as nothing more than a reminder of everything that had been stripped away. "They told me you don't talk much," Danielle whispered, kneeling so she was at eye level with the older woman. "But I think you're just waiting for someone worth talking to." For a split second, the smallest fraction of a heartbeat, Kyung-ya's eyes shifted. It was a microscopic movement, a tiny flare of recognition that died as quickly as it appeared. But it was enough. Danielle saw the intelligence buried under the paralysis, a sharp, academic mind trapped in a biological cage, surrounded by people who treated her like a liability or a ghost. The professor had been compressed. Every year of her life, every accomplishment, every fierce opinion had been squeezed down into this small, fragile shape that didn't dare make a sound. Danielle reached out, intending to adjust the thin silk shawl that had slipped from Kyung-ya's shoulder, but the moment her hand moved, she saw the woman flinch. It was a tiny internal tremor, a tensing of the neck muscles that spoke of a deep-seated, practiced fear. Danielle froze. Her grandmother's words returned to her, a low hum of intuition. "You didn't just hold people up by their arms. Sometimes you held them up by standing between them and whatever made them tremble." "I'm not going to hurt you," Danielle said, her voice dropping into a low, rhythmic cadence. "And I'm not going to let anyone else do it either. We're going to get you back, Professor, page by page." She stood up and did something the other nurses clearly hadn't bothered to do in weeks. She gripped the handles of the wheelchair and turned it, with a low hum of wheels on marble. She moved Kyung-ya away from the dark corner and toward the light. She positioned the chair so the professor could see the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. Kyung-ya didn't thank her. She didn't smile. But as the first rays of evening light hit her face, her chest rose in a single, deep breath, the first real breath Danielle had seen her take. The silence was still there, but as Danielle picked up the top book from the dusty stack, the compression began, ever so slightly, to ease. The third week began not with a breakthrough of words, but with the rhythmic, tactile language of service. Danielle pulled a low stool behind the wheelchair, her fingers nimble and steady. In her lap sat a small wooden bowl of shea butter she had sourced from a market tucked away in a dusty corner of Itaewon, a scent of home that clashed wonderfully with the sterile, scentless air of the Jang penthouse. "My grandmother used to say that a woman's history is written in the tension of her scalp," Danielle murmured, her voice a low, melodic anchor in the vast, quiet room. She began to undo the tight, clinical bun the previous nurses had favored, a style that seemed designed to make Kyung-ya invisible. As Danielle worked, her fingers moving in the intricate, repetitive dance of braiding, she felt the professor's neck muscles slowly yield. It was a slow surrender. Underneath the matted gray strands was a woman who hadn't been touched with tenderness in years. Danielle didn't just braid. She mapped the contours of Kyung-ya's dignity, carving neat, elegant rows that gave the older woman's face a sudden, sharp definition. While her hands worked, Danielle's eyes remained on the book propped open on the side table, a collection of Korean poetry translated into English. "This Yisang fellow," Danielle said, deliberately pitching her voice into a tone of skepticism. "He's a bit of a pessimist, isn't he? All these wings that don't fly and rooms with no doors. It feels a bit like he's given up before the poem even starts." A silence followed, heavy and familiar. Danielle didn't mind. She continued the braid, her fingers tucking a stray silver hair into the pattern. "Now back home, we have poets who write like they're trying to set the paper on fire. They don't just sit in the dark. They demand to know who turned out the lights. I think your Yisang could have used a bit more of that fire. He's too busy being sad to be angry." She felt it then, a sharp, sudden intake of breath from the woman in the chair. It wasn't the flinch of a victim this time. It was the bristling of an intellectual who had just heard something profoundly wrong. Kyung-ya's right hand, usually a dead weight in her lap, twitched. Her fingers grazed the armrest, the knuckles white. Slowly, painfully, the professor's head turned just an inch. Her voice, when it finally came, was a dry, tectonic rasp, a sound that hadn't been used in 3 years. "It is not." "Sadness," Kyung-ya whispered, the words sounding like they were being dragged over gravel. "It is architecture, the architecture of the colonized mind." Danielle's heart thundered against her ribs, but she didn't stop braiding. She didn't gasp or call for the doctors. She simply tightened the grip on the current braid and leaned in closer. "Architecture, huh? Looks more like a collapse to me, Professor. A man building a house out of shadows and wondering why he's cold." "Because," Kyung-ya rasped, her eyes narrowing as they found Danielle's reflection in the darkened window pane, "the shadows are the only thing they could not take away." The argument lasted 40 minutes. It was a slow, grueling battle of half-sentences and pointed silences, but by the time Danielle reached the end of the final braid, the professor's eyes were no longer hollow. They were bright, burning with the friction of a disagreeing mind. As Danielle stepped back to admire her work, she saw a woman who looked less like a patient and more like a general. The neat, crown-like braids gave Kyung-ya a regal silhouette, and the spark in her gaze was a warning. "Same time tomorrow, Professor?" Danielle asked, wiping the excess shea butter from her palms. "I've got some thoughts on your Neo-Confucianists that are really going to ruin your afternoon." Kyung-ya didn't smile, but her chin remained lifted, her gaze fixed firmly on the horizon instead of the floor. The compression was breaking. The silence hadn't just been interrupted, it had been challenged. And for the first time since Danielle had entered the penthouse, she realized that holding someone up sometimes meant giving them something to fight against. The transition from the intellectual to the sensory began in the kitchen, a space of cold steel and silent appliances that looked as though they had never been touched by anything as unruly as a spice. Danielle stood before the industrial stove, the granite countertops reflecting her focused expression. She had spent her own money at a small international market, tucked away from the gleaming boutiques of Gangnam, to find the specific, pungent peppers and the long-grain rice that felt like a prayer in her hands. The scent began as a whisper, the sharp, earthy punch of ginger and garlic hitting hot oil, before it swelled into a roar of tomato and Scotch bonnet. It was a defiant aroma, one that crawled under the doors and through the vents of the sterile penthouse, demanding to be recognized. It was the scent of life, of heat, and of a world that didn't care for the Jang family's quietude. When Danielle wheeled Kyung-ya into the small breakfast nook, the professor's nose crinkled. Her eyes, no longer vacant but sharpened by their recent literary skirmishes, fixed on the bowl of vibrant, orange-red rice. Beside it sat a piece of perfectly blackened fish, the steam rising in a fragrant plume. "This," Danielle said, setting the tray down with a purposeful click, "is jollof. My grandmother used to say you can't argue about the meaning of life on an empty stomach. If you're going to tell me my taste in poetry is pedestrian, you're going to need the energy to do it properly." For the first few minutes, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Kyung-ya looked at the food as if it were an alien artifact. Then slowly, her right hand moved. It was a shaky, agonizingly slow journey, but she gripped the spoon. She didn't wait for Danielle to feed her. With a trembling effort that made the tendons in her neck stand out like wire, she brought a small portion to her lips. The explosion of flavor seemed to ripple through her entire frame. Kyung-ya's eyes widened, her pupils dilating as the heat of the peppers hit her palate. It was a shock to a system that had been fed nothing but lukewarm broths and clinical purees for 3 years. 2. "Hot," Kyung-ya rasped, her voice stronger than it had been the day before. But even as she said it, she was reaching for another spoonful. "It's not heat, Professor. It's character," Danielle countered, leaning against the counter with a satisfied tilt of her head. "Something this house has been missing for a long time." As the meal progressed, the tension that usually hung between them like a physical weight began to dissolve into a rhythmic ease. Danielle didn't hover. She moved about the kitchen, cleaning as she went, humming a low tune that bridged the gap between Georgia and Seoul. Kyung-ya ate until the bowl was nearly empty, a faint flush of color returning to her sallow cheeks. In that small, sun-drenched nook, they found a tempo that didn't require books or braille. It was the rhythm of a shared meal, of a silence that was no longer a cage but a mutual understanding. The professor wasn't just a patient anymore, and Danielle wasn't just a pair of strong hands. They were 2 women at a table, carving out a sanctuary in the middle of a fortress. When the last grain of rice was gone, Kyung-ya leaned back, her breathing deep and even. She looked at Danielle, and for the first time the guarded look in her eyes softened into something resembling trust. "Next Tuesday," Kyung-ya whispered, her gaze lingering on the empty bowl. "Next Tuesday," Danielle promised, taking the tray. "But I'm bringing the habaneros next time. If we're going to fix your spirit, we might as well start a fire." As Danielle walked back to the kitchen, she realized that the scent of the rice hadn't just filled the room, it had anchored Kyung-ya to the present. The scent of truth was simpler than any poem. It was the realization that she was still alive, still capable of hunger, and no longer entirely alone. The warmth of the kitchen was still lingering in the air when the front door chimed, a melodic, expensive sound that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Danielle felt the shift in the penthouse's atmosphere immediately. The comfortable, messy reality of the Jollof Tuesday dissolved, replaced by a sudden, rigid performance of perfection. Shin Hae-in didn't walk into a room, she staged an entrance. She was dressed in ivory silk that looked like it had never known a wrinkle, her hair a sleek, dark river that fell perfectly over her shoulders. She carried a bouquet of white lilies, flowers that smelled of funerals and high-end lobbies, and a smile that was so symmetrical it felt engineered. "Egu, mother, you look so vibrant today," Hae-in cooed, her voice a flute-like trill that grated against Danielle's ears. She didn't look at Kyung-ya's eyes. She looked at the new braids Danielle had meticulously crafted. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes cooled, a flash of predatory annoyance crossing her face at the sight of the professor's regained dignity. Danielle stood by the counter, her hands tucked into her apron, watching the exchange. She saw the way Kyung-ya's posture stiffened, the way the light Danielle had spent weeks coaxing back into the older woman's eyes began to retreat. Hae-in leaned down, pressing a dry, performative kiss to Kyung-ya's cheek, her movements choreographed for an audience that wasn't there. "The help has been busy, I see," Hae-in said, finally acknowledging Danielle with a glance that treated her like a piece of slightly interesting wallpaper. "Tae-hyun mentioned you were unconventional. I hope you aren't overstimulating her." At her age, too much change can be distressing. The professor isn't distressed, Miss Shin. She's engaged, Danielle replied, her voice low and steady. Hayen's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. Of course, how sweet. Later that evening, after Taehyun had returned and the house had settled into its evening hush, Danielle went to the laundry room to retrieve a fresh set of linens. The hallway was a maze of shadows, and as she approached the master study, she heard the muffled sound of voices. She stopped, the heavy cotton sheets bundled in her arms. She's getting better, Haein. Taehyun's voice was weary, filtered through the thick oak of the door. She spoke today. Actual sentences. That's exactly what concerns me, darling. Haein's voice had lost its flute-like lilt. It was now sharp, clinical, and stripped of its sugary coating. She's hallucinating. This American woman is filling her head with nonsense. If she starts claiming she's fit to manage the trust again, the legal team will have a nightmare on their hands. It's better for everyone, especially for her, if we move her to the facility in Jeju. They specialize in late-stage cognitive decline. Jeju, that's 4 hours away. I wouldn't be able to visit. You don't visit now, Taehyun. You fulfill a duty. In Jeju, she'll be a patient, not a ghost haunting your penthouse. Once the papers are signed and she's declared incompetent, we can finally focus on our future, without the weight of a liability holding us back. Danielle felt a cold shiver trace the length of her spine. She stepped further into the shadows as the door began to creak open. Through the gap, she saw Haein leaning against the desk, her face illuminated by the glow of a laptop. The choreographed smile was gone. In its place was the cold, calculating expression of a woman who saw a human being as a hurdle to be cleared. "I'll talk to the doctors tomorrow," Haein whispered, her hand resting on Taehyun's shoulder. "We'll make sure she's moved by the end of the month, before she has a chance to say anything else we might regret." Danielle retreated into the darkness of the laundry room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at her hands, the strong hands her grandmother told her to use to hold people up. For the first time, she realized that holding someone up wasn't just about braiding hair or cooking rice. It was about being the only person standing between a defenseless woman and the people who wanted to erase her. The performance was over. The battle had begun. The following Tuesday, the penthouse was under a different kind of quiet, a heavy, suffocating stillness that felt like a warning. Danielle had spent the morning gathering the ingredients for another meal, her mind replaying the cold calculations she'd overheard in the study. She moved with a sense of urgency, the weight of the Jeju plan pressing against her chest like a physical bruise. When she pushed open the doors to the east wing, she didn't hear the usual scratch of a page turning or the low hum of the television. Instead, the room was bathed in a harsh, clinical light that seemed to drain the color from the walls. She found Kyungya in the far corner. The wheelchair had been turned away from the window, away from the books, and away from the door. The professor was positioned exactly 3 feet from a blank, white wall. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap like abandoned tools, her gaze fixed on the empty expanse of plaster. It was a scene of calculated sensory deprivation, a psychological timeout designed to break a woman who had spent her life navigating the complex architecture of language. "Professor," Danielle whispered, her voice cracking the silence. There was no response. Kyungya didn't flinch. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and glazed with a terrifying sort of vacancy. It was the look of someone who had been forced to stare into nothingness for so long that they had started to become part of it. On the floor beside the chair lay Kyungya's reading glasses. They hadn't fallen, they had been placed there just out of reach, the lenses turned toward the dust. Danielle felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just neglect, it was a strategy. This was the meaner, cruelty Haein practiced when the cameras weren't watching and the sun was buried in his spreadsheets. It was the systematic erasure of a person's sense of self. By stripping away every book, every view, and every distraction, Haein was forcing Kyungya's mind to turn inward until it eventually ate itself. It was the fastest way to manufacture the cognitive decline they needed for the legal papers. "How long have you been looking at this wall?" Danielle asked, kneeling beside the chair. She reached out and gently took Kyungya's hand. It was ice cold. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Kyungya's head turned. The light in her eyes was dim, a guttering candle in a drafty room. She said, "The light hurt my eyes," Kyungya rasped. Her voice was a shadow of the one that had argued about poetry just days before. She said, "I must rest my mind." "She lied," Danielle said, her voice trembling with a rage she struggled to contain. "Your mind doesn't need to rest, Professor. It needs to roar." Danielle didn't just turn the chair. She wheeled Kyungya back to the center of the room, picked up the glasses, and wiped them clean with the hem of her apron. She moved with a sharp, rhythmic intensity, her strong hands shaking as she grabbed the heaviest volume of linguistics from the shelf. As she placed the glasses back on Kyungya's face, Danielle realized the true depth of the battle. Haein wasn't just trying to move a body to Jeju. She was trying to kill the woman inside before the body ever left the building. Every hour spent facing that wall was an hour of Kyungya's life stolen, a deliberate attempt to make her believe she was already a ghost. "We aren't doing the wall anymore," Danielle promised, her grip tightening on the handles of the wheelchair. "From now on, if she wants you to look at nothing, she's going to have to go through me first." Kyungya looked up, her vision clearing behind the lenses. For a moment, the vacancy vanished, replaced by a flicker of the old fire. She reached out, her fingers catching the fabric of Danielle's sleeve, holding on with a sudden, desperate strength. She knew the wall was coming back the moment Danielle left the room, but for now, the light was back and the silence was broken. The opportunity to speak to Tae-hyun came late on a rain-slicked Thursday. He was in the glass-walled study, surrounded by the blue light of 3 different monitors, looking less like a sun and more like a high-frequency trading algorithm in a bespoke suit. Danielle stood at the threshold, her damp palms pressed against the fabric of her apron. She wasn't just carrying a tray of tea, she was carrying the weight of the Jeju conversation she had overheard and the image of Kyungya staring at that blank white wall. "Mr. Jang," she began, her voice steady despite the frantic drumming of her heart. "I need to speak with you about your mother's care, and about Miss Shin." Tae-hyun didn't look up. His fingers continued their rhythmic clatter against the keyboard. "Haein tells me you've been doing well, Danielle. She even suggested a bonus for your unconventional methods. Is there a problem with the salary?" "It's not the money, sir, it's the treatment when you aren't here." The atmosphere in the East Wing changes. I found the professor forced to face a wall for hours. Her glasses were taken. She's being systematically isolated to make her appear more confused than she is. Danielle took a step forward, the words tumbling out with the heat of a confession. "Miss Shin is planning to move her to a facility in Jeju. She's trying to have your mother declared incompetent to take over the trust. I heard her." The typing stopped. The silence that followed was sharper than any shout. Tae-hyun slowly turned his chair, his face a mask of cold, aristocratic disbelief. He looked at Danielle as if she were a glitch in an otherwise perfect system. "You are a housekeeper, Danielle, a guest in this country on a temporary visa," he said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, clinical register. "My fiancée has spent the last 3 years coordinating my mother's specialists, managing her legal affairs, and ensuring this family remains intact. You have been here for 4 months. I've been here long enough to see her flinch when Miss Shin enters the room," Danielle countered, her southern lilt sharpening into a blade. "I've been here long enough to see a brilliant woman being erased because she's an inconvenience to a wedding plan." Tae-hyun stood up, his height intended to intimidate. "You are overstepping a line that doesn't exist for you. If you mention my fiancé's name in a derogatory context again, or if you continue to spread these paranoid delusions about my mother's medical care, I will revoke your sponsorship before the sun comes up. Do you understand how precarious your position is?" Danielle felt the familiar sting of powerlessness, the cold reality of being the help in a world built on bloodlines and bank balances. For a second, she felt the urge to apologize, to retreat into the shadows of the laundry room and keep her head down just long enough to collect her next check. But then she thought of Kyungya's hand gripping her sleeve in that darkened room. She thought of the architecture of the colonized mind, and the way the professor had finally started to fight back. If Danielle retreated now, she wasn't just saving herself. She was abandoning the only person who couldn't walk away. "I understand perfectly, sir," Danielle said, her voice dropping to a low, vibrating hum. She turned and walked out of the study without waiting to be dismissed. As she walked down the long, silent corridor, the fear didn't vanish, but it transformed. It settled in her gut as a cold, hard knot of resolve. Tae-hyun wasn't going to help. He was too blinded by his own duty to see the predator in his bed. Danielle realized then that she couldn't rely on the unseen evidence of her own eyes or the words of a woman who had been silenced. She had to be more than a witness. She had to be the rage that Kyung-ya was too frail to express. She had to be angry for both of them, and she had to find a way to make the invisible visible before the doors to Jeju swung shut forever. Her grandmother was right. Strong hands were for holding people up, but sometimes to hold someone up, you had to be willing to tear the whole house down. The Tuesday of the detonation began like any other, with the scent of ginger and the quiet scratch of a fountain pen as Kyung-ya attempted to write. But the air in the penthouse was brittle, charged with the static of an impending storm. Haein entered the room not with her usual choreographed grace, but with a frantic, jagged energy. She held a stack of legal documents, the Jeju transfer papers. When Kyung-ya, emboldened by weeks of Danielle's fire, refused to sign, the mask finally shattered. The beautiful woman disappeared, replaced by a predator who had run out of patience. "You are a ghost, Kyung-ya," Haein shrieked, her voice a jagged blade. "Sign the papers and die in peace, or I will make sure you die in the dark." Before Danielle could cross the room, Haein's hand lashed out. The sound of the slap was sickeningly sharp, a wet crack that echoed off the marble walls. Kyung-ya's reading glasses spun through the air, hitting the floor with a terminal tinkle of breaking glass. The professor's head snapped back, a fresh, blooming handprint rising on her sallow cheek. In that second, Danielle didn't think about her visa. She didn't think about the line that doesn't have a crossing back. She thought of her grandmother's strong hands and the architecture of a mind that refused to be colonized. Danielle moved. She didn't just step forward, she detonated. Her open palm met Haein's cheek with the force of 4 months of suppressed rage. The impact sent the younger woman sprawling onto the floor, her ivory silk staining as she hit the ground. "Don't touch her again," Danielle hissed, her voice a low, vibrating thunder. "Ever." The elevator chimed. The doors slid open to reveal Tae-hyun, his face turning a ghostly pale as he took in the wreckage. His fiancée weeping on the floor, his mother trembling in her chair with a broken lens at her feet, and his housekeeper standing like a shield, her hand still vibrating from the hit. The aftermath was a blur of blue lights and cold iron. Within the hour, the penthouse was swarming with police. Haein was a masterpiece of victimhood, her face buried in Tae-hyun's chest, her voice a fragile whisper as she told the officers how the unstable American had attacked her without provocation. As the officers gripped Danielle's arms, clicking the handcuffs into place, she didn't look at the police. She looked at Kyung-ya. The professor was watching her, her eyes clear and unblinking behind her one remaining lens. "I'm sorry, Danny," Kyung-ya mouthed, the words silent but unmistakable. "Don't be," Danielle replied as they began to lead her away. "I told you I'd hold you up." As the patrol car pulled away from the gleaming tower, Danielle watched the lights of Gangnam blur through the window. She was facing deportation, a criminal record, and the end of her life in Seoul, but as she felt the cold steel against her wrists, she had never felt more like her grandmother's granddaughter. The house was tearing down, and she was the one who had pulled the first stone. The silence in the penthouse after Danielle's arrest was not the peaceful quiet of a museum, but the suffocating stillness of a tomb. Tae-hyun sat in his study, the blue light of the monitors reflecting off his hollowed eyes. Haein was in the other room, sedated and playing the part of the traumatized victim, but Tae-hyun couldn't stop looking at the floor of the East Wing, at the spider-webbed lens of his mother's glasses. He bypassed the standard security interface, accessing the private server he had installed months ago to monitor the penthouse's climate and structural integrity. He hadn't intended it for surveillance, but the high-definition sensors caught everything. He hit play. He didn't see an unstable housekeeper. He saw Jollof Tuesdays. He saw Danielle kneeling on the floor, patiently braiding his mother's hair while reciting poetry. He saw the strong hands his maid had spoken of, used not to strike, but to lift a forgotten woman toward the light. Then he saw the rest. He saw Hayen turning the wheelchair to face the blank white wall. He saw her pinching his mother's arm when she moved too slowly. He saw the cold, calculated way Hayen had hidden the reading glasses, whispering threats into the ear of a woman who had been a professor of linguistics. Finally, he saw the slap, a vicious, unprovoked strike that made his stomach turn. He watched Danielle move like a thunderbolt, crossing the room to become the shield he should have been. But the server held a deeper layer. Hidden in the encrypted files from 3 years ago, backups from the family's vehicle diagnostic logs, was a report that had been suppressed. Hyun's breath hitched as he read the data from the night of the accident. The brakes hadn't failed due to rain. They had been electronically tampered with, a remote override originating from a subsidiary owned by Hayen's father. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His father hadn't died in a tragic accident. He had been murdered to clear a path for a corporate merger, and his mother had been paralyzed to ensure her silence. Hyun didn't call his lawyers. He called the prosecutor's office. The public reckoning was swift and scorched earth. Within 48 hours, the choreographed smile of Shin Hayen was captured in a mugshot, her ivory silk replaced by a prison jumpsuit. The news of the billionaire's fiancée and the maid who saw the truth dominated every screen in Seoul. 1 week later, the East Corridor was filled with the sound of a house becoming a home. Kyung-ya sat by the window, her glasses restored, her voice full and unsilenced as she read aloud. Beside her stood Danielle. Her visa cleared and her status elevated from servant to the family's most trusted companion. On the windowsill sat a new photo, Danielle and Kyung-ya, mid-argument over a book, both of them laughing. Danielle had come to Seoul to hold someone up, and in doing so, she had kept the whole world from tipping over.